So, I will be talking about accessibility. It's kind of a special interest of mine lately, and I just wanted to share kind of bits of my passion and how to build more accessible forums. This was supposed to be a lightning talk. It won't be, because I started preparing it and got really excited, so there's quite a lot of stuff here. I will separate it on two parts. First, we'll cover web accessibility fundamentals. What is web accessibility, how assistive technology works, and why we should care about it. And then we'll talk about accessibility and common patterns in forums. So, yeah, hi. My name is Kateryna. As Sasha already said, I'm from Ukraine. I've been kind of in software development and front-end for already 10 years at this point. And yeah, just really excited to talk about accessibility things with you. And let's start with the first part. And what is accessibility in general? So accessibility, or because it's such a long word, it's kind of sometimes really hard to spell. So it's often shortened as A11Y. A meaning there's like 11 symbols between A and Y. And it means making things easy for everyone to use, including people with disabilities. And in public space, you can see a lot of examples of some accessible features. For example, like lowering of pavements on the crosswalk, or like this kind of like retractable ramps on the trains, even sliding doors or elevators. And you can see that even though some of these features are intended for people with disabilities, they make public space easier for everybody. So for example, if you're carrying groceries, you would likely use the self-opening doors because it's just way easier. Or you'd say you're kind of having like a stroller with your baby, you would really appreciate kind of lowering of the pavement on the crosswalk. So this is about the kind of like physical space, but how does assistive technology and accessibility works in a digital world with technology? And now we come to the assistive technology. This is kind of like a name for all of the different devices and tools that help people with disabilities to use technology. For example, one really common example is switches. They're called like switch access. Sometimes there are like 1, 2, 3 different buttons that can just basically go forward, back, and kind of select something on the screen. And basically everything is controlled just like with one button sometimes, or with 2 buttons. And it's really fascinating the way it works. And there are like a lot of other cases. For example, Stephen Hawking famously used like little device that controlled twitching of his muscle on the face, and he wrote kind of full books with it, which is really cool. There's also like sip and puff devices. You see, oh, let me use this. Yeah. So basically, when you can sip and puff from the straw, and then also control the device with it. There are also Braille keyboards, so that you can actually feel things with your fingers that you wouldn't be able, for example, to see on the screen. From simpler examples that maybe a lot of us use, there's some like magnifiers, you can change zoom. Those are a lot of like some kind of accessibility features as well. Then there is voice control. You can actually see me here kind of using it. And it basically allows you to control your device fully with your voice. So it shows different numbers on the screen, and you can tell it what to do, like click 4, and then it will click in there. You can see just I said click 4, and then it opened the page. So you can basically control it fully with your voice. For example, if you have some motor disability, so you cannot use your hands to use the keyboard or a mouse. Some people cannot use the mouse, for example, so they mainly use keyboard to navigate the content. And then, of course, there are screen readers. I won't be turning kind of audio here right now, but you can see those are the things that the screen reader says. And the screen reader works in a way that it basically, in automated voice, announces everything on the page and lets you navigate through that page. And works both like with some web pages, and we'll talk a little bit more how assistive tech works in the web, but also with all of the other applications. And you can use it on your phone, and for example, macOS and iOS has a built-in voiceover that you can actually try. And with that, I want just like, who have ever tried using a screen reader? Yeah, cool. So we'll use a little bit of screen reader today. But it's really cool. You can try it later yourself to understand how, for example, products or web pages that you are building are kind of working with the screen reader. Now let's talk about the web, right? All of those different devices I just talked about, and there's many more, right? So there's just like kind of a small handful of them. Let's understand how they work in the web with web technology. So we know when we are rendering a page, right, we have HTML, and based on that HTML, browser generates DOM tree. And then after that, the DOM tree gets kind of like parsed and displayed for the visual UI that then you can use with your keyboard or your mouse. But then how does it work with the some assistive tag? There's actually another process that goes in parallel. So the DOM tree gets actually transformed to so-called accessibility tree. Accessibility tree is like a subset of DOM tree with only semantically relevant elements on the page. So for example, if you had like a bunch of empty divs that we're using for layout, they will be missed in the accessibility tree. And after that, through the specific API, that accessibility tree is used by assistive technology that is usually kind of you have on your laptop or on your phone, and then can be used by the user. And you can actually explore the accessibility tree in Chrome DevTools, for example. I'm sorry, there will be some kind of white slides and some black slides, so there will be like a little bit of flashing here. So for example, you can see here, you can enable, this is like a beta feature, so you can enable a full page accessibility tree and you can explore it. But also if you click with like inspect elements on the page, you can see all of the accessibility information in there. And throughout like me speaking, I said like semantically correct, like semantic information and so on. But what does semantic even mean? And when we say you need to write semantic HTML, why does it matter? And what those semantics even mean? So let's take this example. So this is a button, right? We all understand that this is a button. But how do we understand that this is a button? Because kind of we have some kind of notions about how buttons look like. They are rectangles. Maybe they have a shadow, right? We have seen a lot of buttons before. If we hover on it, maybe it will change color or something will happen. We understand that it is interactive. But how can you understand that this is a button without seeing it? Right? This is where semantics come in. And with web technology, and sometimes it's actually kind of, it happens still a lot, you can create button almost out of anything, right? You can just style a div with some CSS, and it will look like a button. And like sighted users who are using your web page won't really kind of know the difference, right? But the problem is, if we are using the screen reader, when screen reader will come to this element, it will just show order. Like, it won't tell any information because it doesn't have any. It's just like a piece of text on the page. So, and then the user, for example, who's using some kind of like assistive tag, let's say a screen reader, wouldn't be able to understand that this is a button, you can do something with it. And so instead of that, we can use a semantic element that is native to HTML, like a button here, and comes with a lot of built-in stuff, right? You have focus management, you have all of those event listeners with like a keyboard and focus and so on, but also it has some semantic information in it. So then if the screen reader comes to this element, it will say order button, right? So then it will be clear so that you can do something with this element on the page. And making kind of HTML semantic doesn't only help like with assistive technology, it kind of makes your pages a little bit more parsable in general. So just kind of, just a really nice thing to do. It's not only buttons, right? You have headings, you have a lot of stuff in HTML5 that you can use. Now, kind of like another part, why should we care about accessibility in general? So by some calculations by World Health Organization, there's over 1 billion of people with some sort of disability, and it makes around 20% of world population. And it doesn't mean that all of these people use, let's say, assistive technology, but there's not a lot of, I didn't really find a lot of stats on like the use of assistive technology, for example. And yet, and this is also kind of calculated by automatic accessibility analysis tools, 96% of web pages are inaccessible, so they have some detectable accessibility flaws, and not all of the accessibility flaws can be detected automatically, so you can imagine there's like way more. So a lot of people, 20% of, I mean, we don't know exactly, right? But they can't really use the web pages the same way that, let's say, kind of like sighted or able-bodied users can. And generally, it's also often good for business. So sometimes you might have some clients that are asking for you to implement some accessibility features. And you also can just have more users using your product this way. And because of that, there's also a lot of kind of legal regulations that have, like, especially for some companies that operate in like finance and education space. In Europe, for example, there's this European Accessibility Act, and there's an alternative like in America, ADA, or Americans with Disabilities Act. But I think I want to stress the most, or like why we should care about accessibility, because it's generally kind of like an ethical and kind of right thing to do. And also, when we are focusing on accessibility, it tends to make a user experience better for everybody. So when you have a web page and you really focus on accessibility, you have like really good keyboard navigation, you have nice color contrast and so on, it makes it better for all users. Maybe it's your power users who really prefer using the keyboard to be faster, or kind of in a lot of other cases as well. There's also this notion of kind of like situational disability. So for example, if you are in a really brightly kind of lit room, you might not be able to see what you have on the screen, or you might have like maybe a broken trackpad on your laptop, so you are forced to use the keyboard. So it generally just makes the experience better for everybody. And to help us with that, there's also kind of, you probably heard about this, right? Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or kind of WCAG, WCAG, VCAG. A lot of people call it really differently. What it is, it's basically kind of this really big collection of rules of how accessible applications and web pages should behave. And there's like, sometimes you may hear something like, we need to be compliant with WCAG 2.1 AA. What does it even mean? So let's kind of talk a little bit how does the guidelines themselves are organized. So first we have the WCAG, it's the name of the guidelines, that's rather clear. Then the 2.1 is the version. There are multiple versions of the guidelines. So right now the previous one, for example, is 2.0. And the one that right now is in development, in draft stage, we have also 2.2 as well. And then the A, it's kind of like a level. So if you look at the guidelines, there are some requirements or some rules that are for the level A. And we can look at A is something that you must do. It's something that all web pages should comply with. AA is something that you kind of should do. And AAA, it's kind of like a little bit kind of pushing the boundaries and reaching for the stars in terms of accessibility. And something that is important, but it's kind of like way harder to do. So if you look at the regulations, mostly it is AA. So how are you following me so far? So this was the kind of like introduction a little bit about web accessibility and why it's important. And now we can kind of go into talking a little bit more some common patterns and some mistakes that we can do when we are working with forms. And why I decided to focus on forms, because they are kind of like one of the main ways we can interact with the users on our applications, right? So let's talk about some of the things, and I'll kind of separate it on sections, so we'll go kind of one by one. And first, let's talk about some focus styles. So you probably know that all browsers have some kind of default focus outline. Yeah, it kind of like in modern browsers, it looks something like this. Kind of this really kind of like light blue, and in different browsers, it might like a little bit differ. And sometimes it might not really maybe like work really well with your design system, or kind of how like maybe not so aesthetically pleasing. And sometimes it tends to be removed, and you can do something like outline none. But this is something that's not really recommended to do without providing an alternative. You can still change it, and there are like a lot of really creative ways that you can do the outline, but you shouldn't remove it without providing any alternative. Because it is, if you remove any kind of focus indication, it's kind of like removing a mouse cursor for you as a sighted user, as a mouse user. So this is, for example, LHV site, and you see I'm trying to navigate with tabs, and I cannot see anything, right? I don't see where I am. I don't understand how to navigate here. There's like a lot of other issues as well, but this is like really detectable. You can just tab through the page, and I cannot see anything, any indication at all. And the thing is, it's really easily fixed. Right? I just added one line of CSS, and now it is like super easily detectable where I am, and I can navigate through all of the elements here. And also, if you don't want to like have always the focused outline, it can be a little bit disruptive, especially with users who are using the mouse. There's also this new kind of pseudo class in CSS called Focus Visible that will display it only when it is navigated by the keyboard and not the mouse. So it is less disruptive in terms of aesthetics, but it's still very functional for people who are using the keyboard to navigate. Now let's talk about labels. So labels are this like little thing, right, that we put usually somewhere near the input to explain what the input is about. And yes, with HTML, you can just put like any span in there and make it look like a label. But the problem is that when screen reader kind of comes to this input, it will say something like edit text blank, because it doesn't have any information about this input whatsoever. If you're using the placeholder, it wouldn't really kind of use the placeholder for those cases at all. And so we need a way for us to somehow explain what the input is about in HTML, and we have the native label element, right? We can just use that, but of course we also need to somehow to connect it to the input. So there's this for attribute, and we can link this label with the input by ID, and now the screen reader will say name edit text, and it's clear that this is a name property, and we can edit it. It's an input. This is an explicit way to bind label on input. There's also an implicit one where you can just wrap input with a label, but it is mostly recommended to use the explicit one where you actually use the ID and for, because it is better supported by different versions of the screen readers. And now let's talk about some of the inputs and some cases where you kind of, for example, like a search field. A lot of the sites have search fields, and we are kind of already know what the search field looks like. We can understand from the context what it is about. So sometimes just to remove the clutter from the page, we don't want to display the label, but we can still want it to be functional for people who are using assistive tag. So what we can do here is we can still kind of add a label, but we can hide it, right? So it will still exist there in HTML, but we can hide it so all of the kind of individual UI, it won't be noticeable. And there is this really common pattern that you can see used a lot when we're talking about accessibility called like kind of the CSS screen readers only, or like visually hidden. It is something like this. There's like different variations. And this is one of them. Basically, it kind of shrinks the element and hides it from the view, so it is not noticeable visually, but it's still there for the screen readers. So we can do something like that, and then this label will be linked, and it will say search edit text. One kind of really neat kind of like tip, if you're using React, for example, I like to create like a visually hidden component that I can use in all of those cases where I want to display something only for the screen readers, for example, but not to all of the not visually. So it can be used something like that, and you can make it just displayed as anything you want. It's really useful, for example, in icon buttons where you like render an icon, and then you can render a visually hidden label near it. That won't be visible, but then will still be there for semantics. Now let's talk about other case. So you can see that it's really bulky, right? Always include this label. It can feel sometimes a little bit confusing. So another thing that we can do here is use area label. And to kind of let's make a little pause to understand what area is. So area stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And this is basically this really big kind of document that explains a lot of the additional attributes that we can use in HTML to add semantic information about the elements. So, but important thing to note here, and there's like a lot of stuff you can see it in the specification, there's a lot of area attributes you can use, that it does not modify behavior and appearance in any way. It is just there for semantics. So it can be used, for example, announced by the screen readers or other assistive technology, but it does not modify behavior or appearance in any way. So in this case, if we have area label in there, it will still work in the same way, but we have a little bit cleaner code. In most cases, sometimes it can be tempting to overuse area label. And kind of like skip labels completely. But we still need to remember that labels are useful for all of the kind of sighted users or users who are not using assistive tech as well. So for example, this is like email subscription or something, right? The problem with the kind of using placeholder as a label is that it's kind of really light shade of gray. So for example, for people who have maybe some vision impairments, that they cannot see it really well. But also once you type something, you cannot see what it is about. So for example, if you have a little bit more kind of a complicated form, and I actually encountered a couple of examples like that. It's really frustrating when you have an error in there and you're trying to figure out, is it like a building, is it apartment, is it an index? So use labels for the win in most of the cases, and just omit them when it is completely clear from the context of where the input is displayed, what it is about. Regarding label positioning, there's also like a little bit of research. So sometimes you can see labels positions on the side, but it kind of like also decreases the kind of like travel with like your eyesight that you need to do to associate label with an input. So putting them on top of the input is, in most of the cases, more preferred, because then it is way easier and less produces less cognitive load to actually parse the form and fill it in. Of course, one kind of really nice exception of that rule is that if you have like an inline form, then it's like completely fine to have a label in there. Now let's talk about some kind of more additional instructions. So let's say, yes, we already know about the label, but we want to have some additional information about how to fill an input. And it's really good because it kind of helps all of the users to understand and make less mistakes and kind of have less errors when submitting your form. How to do that? First, we can just, I don't know, render a span. It is there, but then it is not there for the assistive technology. We need somehow to link this description with the input itself. And there is a really handy area property called area described by that you can link by ID here, like that, for example, and then it will be associated with an input. In that case, screen reader will say password, secure edit text, then we'll make a pause, and then we'll read out the description. So at least 8 characters. So it is clear for both sighted users, because you see it under the input, but also for all the screen reader users as well. One important note here is that some of the screen readers have so-called form mode, that basically when they enter a form, they are not reading anything except kind of inputs. So basically, if you have, let's say, some kind of paragraph or something, that it won't be able to be read at all. So it is kind of like important to associate everything correctly with the inputs. And then another tip here is that, let's say you have kind of like a React component for the field itself, instead of always kind of like coming up with unique IDs all the time, you can just generate those IDs rather easily. So you can just create really nifty hook to kind of generate an ID and then use it inside the component itself. So you see I'm kind of using it here. And then I created like additional kind of meta ID that I'm using for the description itself. So just that you don't need, as a developer, you also have a better developer experience. You don't need to be coming up with those unique IDs all the time. Now let's talk about required fields and how to implement them accessibly. So let's say we have a form, and then some of the inputs within a form we kind of absolutely need to have, but some of them are optional. The first thing you should probably consider just removing optional fields altogether. It's kind of better for everybody, shorter form. But let's say you cannot do that. One of the kind of really common patterns on the web, there's like displaying this kind of red asterisk near required forms. So let's see how we can implement it accessibly as well. So we have an input here. So the first thing that we can do is we can mark it required, so that it will be required, will be announced by the screen reader. So there is this HTML attribute called required, and then when the screen reader comes to the input, it will say name required edit text. So then when the user comes to the input, it's clear that it is really necessary information. Now this is just, it's not like, it's kind of like a little bit fun thing here, is that like if we put an asterisk in there, it will actually announce name star required edit text. And this kind of brings me to how to hide something from the screen reader while showing it to other users, which can be also really handy with maybe some SVGs or some things that you have only for like visual appearance. So the way that we can do that, we can use area hidden in there. Again, as I said, area hidden doesn't modify appearance in any way, but it adds the semantics. So in this case, it will be hidden from the screen readers. Let's kind of go a little bit over of different ways to hide things. So the area hidden, it is visible in Visual UI hidden for the screen readers. So we already discussed the screen readers only or visually hidden class. It is basically vice versa. If you have something that is hidden through in HTML or display none in CSS, it is hidden from both Visual UI and screen readers. And if you use visibility hidden, I don't know why, but it will also be hidden from both places, but it will still occupy some space in HTML. So kind of we talked a little bit like how to make it required, but there is one kind of small problem with that, because this is HTML attribute, so it comes with HTML behavior, and basically comes with like default HTML validation that looks something like this. And first of all, it might not fit into aesthetics of your product, but also it is not really, kind of sometimes not really user-friendly because it disappears after some time. So you might want to implement your own validation. And this is when, again, area comes in handy. So you can use area required instead. So it will be, again, required. It will be announced by the screen readers that it is required input, but it won't have any behavior associated with it. So yeah, we just discussed on how to make something kind of required that it works in an accessible way. But there's another thing that you can kind of from the visual standpoint consider is actually doing vice versa, not marking required fields, but instead marking optional fields. So there is some research that suggests that these like red stars on the inputs and kind of like required written in red induces stress on the users. So we can do something instead and mark kind of like positive information. This is the optional field. You can rest now. So kind of so you can do something like this and kind of display optional. And I see a lot more products actually do that instead. But in HTML, you still need to use required so that the screen reader users will understand that this is required information. Now we talked about like how to make things required. Let's talk about how to validate things and how to display error messages. And there's two types of error messages we probably want to display. We have some field level validation and we have form level validation. So let's kind of go case by case. So if you want to have something field validated, like this here, so I have like a really small error kind of shown in there. We can do it really similarly with the description. So the first thing we need to do is we need to somehow semantically tell it that this is invalid input, that there's something wrong with it. So we can use area invalid probably, yeah, area invalid true in there. And then we want to use the error, and we can do it in completely the same way that we did for the description. So we have the ID here, email error, and then it is associated with the input by area described by. And then the screen reader will tell email required invalid data, area text, then hit a pause and say the error itself. Now let's talk about the case number 2, right? What if you want to have some kind of form level validation or notifications displayed to the user? This is where we can use a really cool thing called area live. So area live is kind of like a way to describe certain segments of your page that change, and that will be announced by the screen reader specifically. So it supports 2 inputs. You can be assertive or polite. And we'll actually see in the demo how it works out. But basically, assertive, as soon as something changes in there, it will announce it right away, interrupting whatever the screen reader was saying. But polite will kind of wait until a natural pause and then announce the change. It's really useful for some status updates or like errors like in here. So what will happen here, let's say we display this error after clicking the sign up button. So after we click the button, it will immediately say sign up failed, email invalid. And now the part where I wanted to have an audio, so I just wanted to show how this form can be used with the screen reader and how it all works together. So let's see whether the audio works correctly. I think I need to click.
Forms, Google Chrome Kateryna, page has 1 link, 2 landmarks, 4 form controls.
It announces kind of page heading, contents in the beginning, but it is
3
in the
text
settings.
Fields. Name, required edit text, Kateryna. Kateryna. Email, required edit text, Kateryna. Kateryna, Gmail, Code. Phone number, optional, edit text, sign up, button, sign up failed, email is invalid. Phone number, optional, Kateryna@gmail.co. Content selected email, required invalid data, edit text, O-M. Phone number, option, sign up, button, sign up successful.
Yay! So I'm sorry, I was such a loud typer. I didn't realize it was like so loud. But basically you can see both use here the area assertive. We basically announce the error right away. And then in the end, the success message was kind of in polite way, kind of hitting the pause. Now, kind of the last really small things about implementing custom controls. So usually, kind of with the, if you implement some kind of forms, you want to make things kind of look nice in your design language, kind of aesthetically pleasing. So you might need to implement a lot of like autocomplete or like some kind of like select and date pickers and so on. And it can be really complicated. I'm sure each one of those can kind of warrant a talk on its own on how to implement it accessibly. But there's this really cool resource called kind of area authoring practices, where you can click on the specific thing that you want to implement, and it explains how it should be implemented accessibly. But even with this guide, it's still really hard. For example, this is what it looks like, combo box pattern. It kind of explains the pattern. It has a lot of examples, how the keyboard interaction should work. And you need to implement it with JavaScript on your own and with a bunch of area attributes. But to make it simpler, there's a lot of libraries that do it for you, and they provide kind of unstyled components that are accessible, like Redux or Reach UI. So for example, if you need to implement something, it's really kind of sometimes nice to use this kind of library to make sure that it is accessible. And this is more or less it for like the talk thing, but I wanted to share one last tip that I find really cool, especially when you're starting out with accessibility, and helps you learn more while also making your application more accessible. So who is using testing library here in general? A lot of hands, right? Testing library is really cool, right? And the one cool thing about it, it has all of the kind of accessibility API, so you can basically select elements by their accessible roles and labels, and this is the kind of recommended way of using testing library. So for example here, this is actually test for the form that we just looked at. You can see that I can get input by label text, and then I can check that it is required and so on. So basically you have access to all of those kind of accessible attributes that we were just adding. And I think this is a really cool way, kind of just force yourself to write tests using those kind of like accessible selectors. You can both learn more about accessibility while also fixing some of the issues that you are finding. So for example here, you see I'm first was entering things, then kind of like submitting the form. You can see it all can be kind of gotten by role. Then here's the kind of alert that we just talked about, right? So you can get alert and see that it actually announces the correct content. And then you can check that all of the elements are invalid, or have some kind of like specific error associated with them. And then we can clear things, kind of submit again, and then we can check that the sign up was successful. So you see the test itself is super clear. It's super clear what is happening, but also you're using all of the accessibility tree under the hood. So while testing, you're also making sure that things are accessible. And also in this way, you can learn more about some of the accessible roles as well. And one thing I want to say, that like making things kind of more accessible is not black and white. So you usually kind of make small steps to make it better for the users. And there's a lot of really easy and small wins along the way. And I hope that with this talk, I kind of inspired you a little bit more to kind of like move towards making things more accessible in your web pages and products. Yeah, I was really excited to just share this kind of passion of mine, and hope you enjoyed it. So thank you. Yeah, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Yeah, there's a question.
Hi, awesome talk. What ways to test do you recommend? I'm usually like Lighthouse has now warnings for accessibility issues, and some libraries like Svelte have really good ones, and I fix them always. But is there some other like a test framework that you should propose? Or?
Yeah, I think there's, the thing is with automated kind of like frameworks that kind of find issues for you, is that they are kind of limited by default. They can find only things that are like easily findable. But sometimes when you have a little bit more kind of like severe issues, you wouldn't really even detect them with them. So I think the thing that works the best is kind of just trying it with yourself. For example, like if you're writing tests with testing library, using the roles, it will force you a little bit more to think about whether you're adding the roles correctly and so on. Then also, you can, I lost my thought. There was a thought and I lost it. Test with the screen reader yourself, right? You can just kind of go through it and see in the accessibility tree, because there's a lot of automated ones, and they kind of are mostly kind of similar in their sense. You can have some ESLint rules and so on, but then it still doesn't really kind of negate the need to test things. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, thanks. And also, what do you think about reusing ARIA annotations? A while ago, I saw a few frameworks that, for example, annotation libraries or something that forced you to reuse like ARIA required or something like that, and try to reuse that for other purposes, and that way it also added those annotations. Is that still a thing, or
reusing like for styling?
Not for styling, but for to add some behavior to ARIA annotations, or is that bad practice?
So I mean, generally, if you have a semantic element, you should prefer to use it, right? So if you don't need to implement your own button, you can style it, and it already comes with a lot of built-in stuff. But in some cases, as I mentioned, those custom components, you would use ARIA, and then you have some JavaScript to help you add some behavior. There's no way around that. So especially if you have more complex controls, like kind of pop-ups, model, for example, it's kind of sometimes really hard to implement accessibly. So. I didn't understand like the reusing part, but it's okay to use ARIA in those custom controls, and then kind of like create your own things if you need it, like with ARIA, like pressed and so on. Did I answer it? Okay.
Any other questions? No. Okay, you're up next.
Thanks for your talk. Basically, two quick questions. One of them is, let's say maybe you join some project, and basically it's written in React, and this project uses some UI library. And this UI library does not support sort of accessibility options out of the box. What would you do then? Would you suggest maybe to migrate to some other library, or would you say, okay, whatever, let's just ignore it, or maybe there is something else you could do in this case?
So yeah, I think if you're coming with some, like there's some components that are already built in, it would be really hard to add something on top, because then you would be kind of modifying some non-public API. So kind of like hijacking the end UI kind of like components wouldn't be probably like the best way to do that. One way could be if you already have it, like already use all of those kind of like library components, you can, and you find the ones that are like the most inaccessible, you can just kind of migrate using maybe some unstyled libraries and kind of like just copy the styles over and so on. Kind of generally long-term kind of migrating towards something that supports kind of some accessibility features better would be probably beneficial, right? So, yeah. Okay. That was the first question?
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, and second question, maybe in your experience, wanted to ask, did you have like, let's say you do some code review and your colleague does not include, basically he builds some form and does not include accessibility like to this form. And you, of course, would leave a comment like, please spend some extra hours to make this form accessible, and he would say, like, oh no, you know, it's a waste of time. Let's keep it as is. What would you do? How would you sort of? What would you do in this case?
Yeah, this is a really common thing, you know, and something I heard a lot. We don't need accessibility, right, or something. We don't have blind users or something. This is basically something that you can kind of hear a lot. But I think here, first of all, highlighting things that are non-negotiable in a way. There's law. You have clients, you have maybe some clients that are using, and so you can say that there is some kind of like legal obligations or compliance. This is something that's really hard to kind of argue against, but I think doing generally in the company, doing more advocacy towards like accessibility, like for example, sharing, doing maybe like an internal talk about why it is important, like sharing all of those points and so on. Maybe kind of writing some of the documentation about like how to do things kind of in a better manner and so on. Could be nice, but also if you have, let's say, design system, just making your design system itself kind of accessible with a lot of things will kind of just already fix a lot of problems with you, so you wouldn't need to kind of spend so much time on the code review, because if it comes super cheap, then there's just no kind of no need to decide whether to implement it or not, because it kind of comes already built in. But kind of just across the company, sharing knowledge and kind of advocating a little bit more, maybe having some best practices, and a lot of maybe some kind of like mini components and things to reuse as well.
Okay, thank you so much.
Hi, thank you for the talk.
Hi, Ilya.
Have you ever tried to listen the form where submit button out binded via attributes ID and form, and this button made outside of the form? Does it work from the
I don't
accessibility
know.
perspective?
I didn't have the need to try it. If somebody knows and tried it, you can tell it. But it's easily testable, so you can kind of like try it out, I guess. But I'm not even sure how do you bind like the button to the form.
ID and form.
Yeah.
ID
Okay,
and form attribute, yeah, but
No, I mean, imagine if you, I mean, probably should work, but I don't know.
yeah, technically it worked, but I don't know about
it's
accessibility
yeah,
perspective.
the best way to test it, you know,
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
kind of always like a lot of different cases, and it might work differently in different screen readers and different versions.
Probably,
So sometimes just you usually
Okay.
try to use the kind of the most straightforward option, so it is the best supported across different versions.
From the statistics, if W3S rules made, so the all accessibility tools usually support that, or
Yeah,
it depends.
I mean, they often define the rules as not like you need to use this specific attribute. They define the rules as it needs to be kind of in a little bit more softer manner, so it's not super rigid. But generally, you can see the how they're well supported on. Basically, there's like on Area website, you can see how things are supported on MDN and kind of try it out. But it's kind of like a lot of.
We can be sure that if attribute works between button and form, that it not mean that the tool will be support, right?
Yeah, because
Okay.
yeah, different screen readers have a little bit different things, like, and they're also updating, so they can work differently. But you can always check kind of like two main screen readers, let's say, and see how it works there. But I'm also sure that there should be kind of some things written by people who are kind of like accessible, like on some accessibility kind of resources that you can see how it can be implemented.
Okay, thank you.
So should we be? I think we are already a little bit late, so
Yeah,
maybe
we're out
it's
of time.
all for the questions.
Yeah.
I
Can you pick the
I
best?
choose. Oh, where is he? Yeah, you had the best question. Yes, you'll get a T-shirt.
Okay, well, I'll approach you later on. Okay, thank you very much. Kateryna?
Yeah.